Being the heir to the Arachnean Empire seems like an absolute position of power, but anyone who has started playing The Life and Suffering of Prince Jerian knows that the crown is actually a sentence of pure anxiety. Every dialogue choice or political alliance carries an absurd weight, and the Dame simply does not forgive mistakes. To save you from the frustration of losing everything over a detail that went unnoticed, I have put together 10 advanced tips that completely changed the way I play and might help you as well. I'm Mary, and the video is about to start.
If there is one thing this game does exceptionally well, it's silently punishing you when you start giving up your own boundaries, and Sanity is precisely where this weighs the heaviest. At first, it's tempting to yield to family pressure, go with the flow, avoid conflict, but the game is keeping score. Each morally questionable decision accumulates an invisible cost that, when it surfaces, is already too late. What makes it even more intriguing is how it directly impacts gameplay, not just the narrative. When Jerian's sanity starts to drop, you literally lose access to logical reasoning options. It's not just a matter of, oh, he's more unstable. The game cuts off mental pathways that were previously available. This completely alters how you solve problems and even how you interpret situations. Then comes the blood axis, which to me is one of the most treacherous mechanics in the game. The more you yield to the family, the further you distance yourself from the character's mental clarity. It feels like you're playing it safe, but in reality, you are digging a hole. By the time you notice, Jerian is already reacting impulsively, restrictively, almost trapped inside his own choices. To play well, you need to start treating sanity as a resource just as vital as any classic stat. Doing what is convenient or politically correct within the family is not always the best path. Sometimes maintaining lucidity requires making tough calls and even confronting those in power. And that is precisely where the game shines. It forces you to choose between mental stability and submission. Look, if there's one thing the game doesn't explain well at the beginning, it's that your own promises can turn into your political death warrant later. At first glance, the legacy mechanic seems like a great way to give Prince Jerian a soul. You pick an ideal, a promise he makes to himself, and you think you're building a tragic and beautiful arc. In practice, however, you're dropping an anchor at the bottom of the sea, and the chain will only pull when you least expect it. The game takes the weight of a given word very seriously. When you start making state decisions, the kind that keep the realm running, alliances alive, and food on the people's table, that is when the sting hits. That innocent oath from the beginning, that legacy that felt so personal, turns into a concrete wall. Suddenly, the only way to prevent a civil war or a revolution demands the exact thing you swore never to do. That's when it hits you. Promises made to yourself in this game are actual shackles, and they tighten over time. I learned the hard way that clinging to a legacy with all your might is a luxury Jerian cannot afford most of the time. The consequences aren't merely emotional, they are practical, structural, and can render your path completely unviable. The tip that truly changed my approach was to stop viewing these promises as absolute commandments and start treating them as chess pieces. Sacrificing a personal ambition in Act 1 might be what gives you breathing room in Act 3 when the political board is on fire. So before making that emotional, epic choice at the start, be honest with yourself. Are you willing to keep that word until the end, even if it means sinking the kingdom? Because the game offers no neat shortcuts. True legacy isn't what you swore when everything was easy, but what you built after deciding, strategically, that certain promises must be broken so that greater things may survive. It's cruel, it's personal, and that is precisely why it works so well. This divine pact mechanic is, in my view, one of the cleverest aspects of the game, because it pulls the religious system out of the background and places it right at the center of the experience. It isn't just about choosing to be devout or skeptical for roleplay purposes. Here, every spiritual decision echoes directly throughout the world. As Primate, you aren't just a symbolic figure, you literally hold the link between the people and the twin gods, and the game makes you feel that weight constantly. What I find most fascinating is how this impacts the clergy in an organic way. If you start making choices that weaken the pact, the clergy doesn't simply get angry, it loses faith, starts acting more unstably, and that can turn into a genuine political crisis. On the flip side, keeping the pact strong gives you a powerful base of support, but it also binds you to specific expectations. You can't please everyone, and the game makes that crystal clear. Now, where this tip truly shines is in provincial stability. This is the kind of system many people overlook early on, focusing only on immediate narrative choices. Over time, however, neglecting the pact can trigger a domino effect, regions growing more chaotic, conflicts emerging, and you having to handle crises that could have been avoided. It's the type of system that rewards long-term thinking. For me, paying close attention to the pact completely transforms how you approach decisions. You stop focusing solely on immediate outcomes and begin weighing religious, social, and political consequences simultaneously. And that fits perfectly with the game's core premise, placing you in a position where every single choice carries a real cost, especially when you are the one responsible for keeping the world spiritually stable.
One thing that many players might overlook during a first run is the actual weight of these female figures in Jerian's journey. It might seem like the game is merely offering romance paths, but in practice, it's defining how the character views the world. Each archetype, mother, friend/rival, and mystery functions almost like an ideological lens, shaping your choices far more deeply than it appears at first glance. What I found most intriguing is how these characters act as anchors for sanity. In a game where the protagonist's mind can easily deteriorate, having this kind of support isn't just narrative, it's mechanical. Depending on who you connect with, certain choices become more stable and mentally safe, while others turn chaotic or difficult to sustain. And it's not just about avoiding madness, it's about who you become politically within the story. The mother tends to lean toward tradition and structure. The friend or rival provides a more human and conflicting contrast. And the mystery figure opens doors to less predictable paths. The game uses these relationships as a foundation to define not only your actions, but also how the world reacts to you. To me, the key takeaway here is to stop viewing these characters merely as romance routes and start treating them as pillars of Jerian's character development. Ignoring this or treating it as secondary can leave you directionless, both in terms of narrative and sanity. Choosing who to align with is, deep down, choosing what kind of prince you are willing to be. We go in with that classic RPG instinct of wanting to be the good hero, or at least believing there is a right choice that won't come back to bite us later. But this game simply doesn't play that way. Every decision made from the throne is a transaction, and the currency of choice almost always seems to be gold, power, or a temporary moment of peace. The problem is that the game never shows you the full receipt up front. It holds on to half of it to collect with interest later, and you only feel the weight when it's already too late. Take the situation with the oligarchs. They show up with pockets full of gold, dirty deals, and a quick fix for the kingdom's budget deficit. Accepting their corruption feels smart in the moment. You think, okay, I need this money to maintain the army so we don't collapse right now. And it works. The treasury fills up, the immediate crisis passes.
But then 3 acts later, you see riots in the streets, popular reputation down the drain, and suddenly that pragmatic choice becomes the final nail in the coffin for your legitimacy as a ruler. The game doesn't give you a red warning banner. It simply lets you figure it out on your own in the harshest way possible. This is one of the core truths of its design. There is no pure moral path here. You cannot be the perfect prince who pleases everyone, because every choice is a sacrifice. The game just hides the knife until you feel the blood. The oligarch's corruption is merely one example. It could be a risky military alliance, a broken promise to a trusted ally, or an unpopular law that solves an immediate issue. The game forces you to think like an actual ruler, not an adventurer with a neat karma meter. You have to look beyond the next scene's tooltip and see the entire board. The tip that truly changes the experience is to stop searching for the correct decision and start playing chess with the future. Ask yourself before clicking, am I willing to pay this bill 5 hours of gameplay from now? Because it will come collecting. The life and suffering of Prince Jerian is built to punish those on autopilot and reward those who plan 3 moves ahead. The throne is no place for the impulsive, and the game makes sure to remind you of that in the most personal and painful way possible. This tip is almost like playing with world memory, you know? If you're already familiar with the life and suffering of Sir Brante, you can feel that the universe of Prince Jerian doesn't start from scratch. The social rules, the rigidity of the castes, the way wills and testaments shape people's lives, all of that remains alive. Once you grasp this legacy, your choices stop being gambles and become far more calculated. The point is that the society in this world does not react well to sudden shifts. Breaking a tradition isn't an isolated act, it's practically tampering with an entire framework that holds the social order together, and the game respects that consistently. If you ignore this context, you can end up triggering heavy resistance from the masses, even with choices that seem right at first glance. What makes this interesting is how it sharpens your political reading of the game. Instead of merely reacting to events, you begin anticipating behavior. Things like, if I do this, this faction will feel threatened, or this change will cause instability because it violates established laws. This completely transforms the experience as you begin playing almost like a social strategist rather than just a leader making isolated calls. To me, understanding Sir Brante's legacy is what separates a chaotic playthrough from a controlled one. You start noticing patterns, grasp the weight of traditions, and use that to your advantage. Ultimately, it makes the game far richer because you aren't just selecting paths, you are navigating a pre-existing system that was in place long before your character arrived. When you open the personality system in the life and suffering of Prince Jerian for the first time, the natural inclination is to think you can balance everything. You look at those 3 pairs, reason versus feelings, will versus blood, love versus law, and think, I'll be a versatile prince, a bit of both sides. But the game hides a rather harsh truth. In each of these pairs, the points total exactly 10. It is a zero-sum system, and every time you push Jerian toward one side, the opposing side drops automatically. There is no way to be mature and impulsive, or calculating and visceral at the same time. The choice is permanent, and the game never lets you forget it. This is the trap that catches many players in the middle ground. You think you're being sensible by avoiding extremes, but in practice, you are throwing away the character's potential. Remaining in the center of these spectrums is almost like having no stance at all. You fail to unlock the exclusive choices at the extremities, and those options are extraordinarily powerful. When you truly commit Jerian, when you push all in on one side, the game unlocks dialogue and decisions that simply do not exist for those lingering in the gray area. The catch is that by doing so, you lock out the opposite path forever. That door will not open again. Yet there is a cost the game makes explicitly clear and that you must respect. The more extreme you become, the more you damage the prince's reason. It's almost as if the game is telling you that a man absolute in only one thing cannot keep his sanity intact. Losing reason isn't just a number on a character sheet. It's the game warning you that Jerian is collapsing internally, that the pressure of being purely rational or purely emotional is eroding his psyche. You might have the strongest build and the best narrative options, but the knife in your hand is rusted and pointed straight at you. The takeaway after hours with the game is that you need to decide early on what kind of tragedy you want to experience. Choose your extreme, build around it, but never assume you are playing for free. To polarize is to sign a blood contract. You gain incredible tools to tell the story, but the game reserves a heavy price to collect down the line. It's not about making the right build. It's about knowing exactly what you are willing to sacrifice inside the prince's head. If you've played something like Brante prior to taking on the life and suffering of Prince Jerian, your first instinct is to look for that classic game over, the death that sends you straight back to the loading screen. But this game plays with you in a more subtle and frankly terrifying way. There is no traditional health bar here that dictates whether Jerian lives or dies. What does exist is reason, a resource capped at 5 points that serves as the true gauge of his survival. Every time you make a decision that contradicts the personality Jerian has established, this stat plummets, and that is when the game shows its teeth. The cruel part is that reason is no decorative stat. It is finite, fragile, and remarkably easy to lose if you play on impulse or try to force decisions that conflict with the path you've chosen for the prince. When it hits 0, the game doesn't grant you a clean death. It forces you down paths of self-destruction into a broken mental state that completely shifts the narrative tone. It's like watching Jerian unravel from within, making progressively worse choices because his mind can no longer bear the weight of contradictions. This is far heavier than a standard game over, because you keep playing, only now with a character destroying himself on screen. What saved my runs more than once was understanding that legacy and sanity function as a sort of safety valve, a bypass allowing you to absorb certain choices without draining as much reason. Utilizing these mechanics wisely is essentially buying emotional insurance for Jerian. But here is the serious warning. Do not treat this bypass as a free pass to ignore reason costs on major decisions. It exists to soften the blow, not to give you carte blanche. Overusing it means depleting your protective resources right when you need them most, leaving Jerian exposed without a shield for the decisions that truly matter. The lesson here is that reason must be treated as the game's most precious resource, even more so than gold or reputation. Every choice you make must pass through the filter of, is this consistent with who Jerian has become? Because the game is always monitoring that internal consistency. The life and suffering of Prince Jerian doesn't punish improvisation with a black screen. It punishes with the slow erosion of your character's mind. And that, to me, carries far more weight than any conventional death found in other RPGs. One of the easiest things to misinterpret in the life and suffering of Prince Jerian is treating skills as traditional RPG attributes, assuming the higher the stat, the better at everything. That's simply not how the game operates. Management, scholarship, and diplomacy range from 0 to 20, rarely decrease, and look like safe, linear progression. In practice, however, they function far more like keys than brute force metrics. Having an 18 or 20 matters far less than hitting the exact threshold required to unlock a specific option at a critical moment. It took me a while to realize this, as natural instinct pushes you to raise everything evenly as if building a well-rounded character. But the game rewards intentional investment far more. Each skill unlocks distinct paths depending on how it pairs with your personality axes. It isn't just about having high diplomacy, it's about having high diplomacy as a prince who leans toward love, for example. This creates entirely different narrative paths compared to someone with high management who leans toward law. The game begins to feel less like a numbers system and more like a system of identity. A clear example: you can resolve a political crisis through high diplomacy by negotiating and appeasing all parties, or you can crush the issue with high management through a colder, structural approach. Both work, but they yield different consequences and say a lot about who Jerian is becoming. That brings us to the crucial detail. Trying to do everything at once usually leaves you locked out of the best options because you won't hit the required thresholds at key moments. The tip that shifted my approach was to stop thinking in terms of leveling up skills and start thinking about which doors do I want to unlock on this route. Deciding early on which skills to prioritize and align them with your personality makes the playthrough flow much better. The life and suffering of Prince Jerian doesn't expect you to excel at everything. It expects you to be specific, almost obsessive, because those focused choices are what turn your campaign into a unique experience. At first, I treated the affairs system as secondary, like side activities you engage with only when you have spare time. That was a major oversight. While the game's grand events seem to dominate everything, it's the affairs, these long-term imperial or personal projects, that actually give you fine control over the kingdom's direction. It's the difference between reacting to chaos and shaping it before it becomes an issue. What makes them interesting is that their impact is subtle, less explosive than a critical story decision. That subtle nature is precisely where their value lies. Through a well-chosen affair, you can gradually shift the empire's axes: progress versus tradition, equality versus elitism, law versus dogma, without having to gamble everything on a single high-stakes choice. It's like steadily adjusting a ship's rudder rather than trying to turn the wheel all at once in the middle of a storm.